everyone, welcome to Star Wars Canon. Today we're going to be talking about Into the Dark by Claudia Gray. As always, we will be getting into deep spoiler territory, so if you have not read Into the Dark, I encourage you to go do so, and we'll come back and watch our video as we kind of walk through what happened and give some commentary on all the little details you might have missed. So we're going to have Scott, our outline guru, walk us through the events of the book, and then we'll all kind of chime in as we walk. Scott, take it away.
Cool. So Into the Dark kicks off sort of mid-action sequence. We start with a chase scene where Jorah Malley and her Padawan Reath Silas are taking down some pirates. And it's a pretty action-packed sequence with sort of Reath trying to tether onto the pirates and getting pulled down with it, and Jorah sort of having to, navigate around all this action sequence. But it does a really good job of introducing us to Reath Silas, who I would consider most likely sort of the main character in this book. And we get an introduction that Reath is really not the strongest in the Force, but his dedication and perseverance and, in a sense, just overall effort make up for that, and sort of in turn make him a stronger Jedi and stronger Force user than others, just sort of out of sheer perseverance. We've seen Jorah in some previous stuff. We know that Jorah is going to be, as the Starlight Beacon is taking off in the Outer Rim, is meant to be the leader of the temple out there, and basically relays that to Reath, who spends his time mostly in the archives on Coruscant and really hasn't spent much time outside of Coruscant and isn't really wanting to spend time outside of Coruscant. But basically is informed that because of Jorah's assignment on the Starlight Beacon, that they're going to be leaving Coruscant and be spending the foreseeable future in the Outer Rim.
Yeah, really quickly, Scott, just to cut in here, I thought it was pretty interesting. We begin right away with Jorah's character. As you kind of mentioned, we're familiar with Jorah from Light of the Jedi, and I don't know if I should mention what happens with Jorah in Light of the Jedi. Hopefully, if you're watching this channel or watching this video, you've read Light of the Jedi. But she does not make it out of that book. So I thought it was really interesting that we kind of started with that character, given that we kind of know where her ultimate fate resides, and kind of felt this whole time very, very, very sorry for Reath, knowing what would soon befall Jorah in the near future.
Yeah, and the initial way they describe Reath in this beginning reminded me a lot of how they described Obi-Wan in the beginning of Master and Apprentice as well. Like he's definitely not confident, and he also feels a little bit overwhelmed that his master is such a renowned master. She's on the council, and he just kind of feels like he's not living up to expectations, which I think is a good setting off point for the book.
Yeah, this whole sequence to me really felt a lot like the speeder chase on Coruscant in episode 2 with Anakin and Obi-Wan going after the bounty hunter. Something else, and I'm not sure if this was in your outline, Scott, that I thought was pretty cool, and this is just a smaller detail, was before Reath goes to kind of leave Coruscant on his journey out to the frontier to Starlight, the other Padawans throw him a going away party, and they're basically like dancing and like having what they imply as like alcoholic beverages, which I don't think we've ever seen that depiction of the Jedi. And again, the High Republic series is paving new ground in terms of our view of the Jedi and what they get up to, which I thought was pretty cool.
Yeah, there's a lot of moments throughout this book where the Jedi are more lenient than they are in the prequel time period, which makes me think that somewhere between here and there, quite a few people must fall to the dark side and make them think we can't be lenient, and sets up really what we eventually get in the Skywalker kind of saga from it. But we'll have to hit, there's some key points later that they're blurring the edges of the code, I feel like, a little bit.
Yeah, I think like you mentioned, Josh, they have like this like pseudo alcoholic stuff that they mentioned like not forbidden for people their age, but not really consumed by Jedi, unless it's a special occasion and stuff like that. Like,
and literally Reath shows up to leave and he's a little buzzed. He even says, "I hope the other Jedi who are traveling with me don't
Yeah.
see that I'm a little tipsy here."
Yeah. So after Reeth's going away party, we learn that Reeth isn't going to be traveling with Jorah to the Outer Rim, or they refer to it a lot as the frontier, in this book specifically. But he's going to be sort of on a chartered ship. And the fact that Jorah and Reeth are sort of separated is, I think, a big part of Reeth's character in this, and that he's often influenced by some of the things that he knows Jorah would think about him. Or one of her parting sort of words to him was referencing a Kyber arch in a Jedi temple that's a place of meditation that's sort of assembled from the Kyber crystals of fallen Jedi. And she tells him that, like, this, is as an arch that you can't cross alone. That's kind of a riddle to him, because he's seen people walk over this arch by themselves, and he doesn't really get sort of why that's something that she left with him as like a parting riddle and parting thing to meditate on his journey. But he is going to be traveling to the Outer Rim via a chartered cargo ship that's called the Vessel. It's part of the Bine Guild. And it has a cast of characters that isn't just Reeth that's going to be going along for the ride. So joining on the Vessel for the journey is another Jedi Knight, Des Ryder. He comes across more of like a swashbuckling Jedi who's very known for like his adventures and sort of his outgoing spirit. He is also Jorah's previous Padawan, which kind of juxtaposes the Padawan she's had, that she has someone that's like up for adventure and up for traveling, and now her current Padawan of Reeth is sort of an introvert and sort of introspective and loves studying in the archives. And so sort of given that history, they know each other and they're friends. Also along for the ride are two other Jedi Masters, one is Jedi Master now becoming a Wayseeker, Orla Jareni. A Wayseeker they describe as a Jedi who wants to operate independently of the Jedi Order. Basically just a way for them to sort of connect and with the Force in a deeper way that's sort of outside of the dictates of the Jedi Order. And then someone that she has a history with, that's a Jedi Master, Comac Vitus or Vitus. Comac Vitus, who's well known, especially to Reeth, as a scholar and a mystic. Yeah, he's seen as an archivist of knowledge. They mention that like most of the book Reeth has read in the archives has some sort of footnote or contribution has come from Comac. But we also learned that Comac and Orla have known each other and were Padawans together. And then the ship itself has a crew. Affie Hollow, who's the co-pilot of the Vessel, and the sort of adopted daughter of Scover Bine, who's the head of the Bine Guild that runs the Guild of Freighter ships. Leox Gyasi, the captain of the Vessel, or Gyasi.
They were calling him in the audio Gyasi.
Leox Gyasi. And then Geode, who's the navigator of the Vessel and is basically a sentient boulder or a rock. They say he's a Vincian or a Vintian. I don't know how the audiobook might have mentioned it. But he basically is a rock that they talk to and seemingly responds in different ways, but never is seen moving throughout the book, and kind of adds some interesting comic relief throughout.
Yeah, this
really,
is a great. I was going to say, this is a great cast of characters with very wildly different personality types. So I think this sets up, I think, a little bit of a better storyline than Light of the Jedi, where we're jumping all over the place throughout the story. This is much more focused with a core group of people. And the histories between the people make it interesting, but the personalities make it just as interesting. I mean, Leox is Matthew McConaughey. So you have Matthew McConaughey with a rock, like as the captain and navigator. So some of the stuff I think from that really puts it on a good direction as far as the journey and the story between the characters.
Yeah, absolutely. And as soon as we kind of get introduced to them and we start our journey on the Vessel, Claudia Gray, the author, kind of takes an opportunity to kind of do these little vignettes into each of the characters' heads, and you quickly realize that they're all carrying baggage. Orla, who's thinking about or commencing her journey to become a wayfinder is very uncertain about her path and whether it's the right thing. And Comac is also kind of carrying a weight on his shoulders that we'll learn more about later. And then even Dez, he I guess was on a previous mission to Zetoween, which I think might be a new planet we haven't previously heard about in canon, but we find out he actually resigned from that mission. Like he was kind of so frustrated, and we learned that he was actually concerned that he was close to kind of giving into his anger, and that's kind of why he stepped away. So it really quickly amps up the drama by putting all these interesting characters who have a lot going on, and again, kind of breaks the mold of what we would expect from Jedi. Usually we're trained to think that Jedi are these kind of perfect monks, and clearly this cast of characters has a lot more going on for them.
Yeah, I think you're right. You do have a lot of really interesting characters. And it's interesting the way that they get juxtaposed against each other, especially Orla and Comac, especially when you learn a little more of their history that we'll get into shortly. But that Orla is basically on her way out of the Jedi Order in a sense, and then Comac is still really tied to the Jedi Order, but by going to the frontier, he has a history of where they're going to, and so it's kind of like him having to face his past in a lot of ways that we learn.
And I guess we should mention that I think it might be Reith that describes Comac this way, but he calls him a folklorist. Mm-hmm. So he's a Jedi who goes and kind of collects stories and folklore from various cultures, and that's the reason he's kind of going out to the frontier, is to start to collect these stories and histories from these other planets, which I thought was a pretty cool job for a Jedi too.
Yeah, one of my favorite parts was when Reith was asking Comac about that, and him describing like how you go and glean stories from people who don't really want to share their stories with you. And that's kind of the secret that he's learned throughout time of pulling the deepest like lore from the galaxy. Comac for me became my favorite character, I think, maybe so far in High Republic through this. Like I really, and I didn't think that when the book started, just to say that too. Like he seemed like he might be the least interesting person, but I think there's a lot of layers to his character that could be continued to be dug into following this book.
Yep.
Well, moving on. So that as soon as these characters sort of gathered on the ship, which is known as the vessel known as the vessel, they depart for the Starlight Beacon to be a part of the opening of that. And while they're traveling through hyperspace is when the great disaster rather occurs. Their ship is able to sort of escape out of hyperspace through some built-in coordinates. And arrive in an area where some other ships seems to have escaped to as well. Their ship is a little bit damaged, but they're able to make it out okay. And sort of in the midst of this chaos, we learn that Leox and Affy actually recognize the ship that's been torn apart of the Legacy Run is actually a part of their guild, the Bind Guild. And then there's some concern, especially from Affy, that her adopted mother, Scover Bind, was potentially on that ship, just because it was moving such a large number of cargo and a large amount of people, that it was an important journey that she might have been overseeing it herself. Landing sort of in out of hyperspace, they are amongst some other ships, and they get in distress call from a ship, one of these ships, and Orla immediately stops them from answering that. And that kind of segues us into the first of several parts that we jump back in time in the book to a 25 years earlier section with Orla and Comac, in which they're Padawans with their respective masters, Lorette Soverall for Orla and Master Simics with Comac. And they're on their way to sort of negotiate or solve a hostage crisis. The leaders of two opposing planets, Queen Thandeka of Irem and Monarch Cassel of Irono, had been captured by a Lasat named Issamer and their sort of crew. And as they're traveling, Issamer baits the Jedi with a fake distress call, to which Orla responds, which sort of gives away their position and leads to them being shot down, which is sort of the tie-in to Orla immediately stopping them from replying to the distress call in the current timeline.
Yeah, the only thing I'll note here is, first of all, I thought it was pretty interesting to have this format where we're kind of consistently over the course of the book jumping back in time and getting more insight into this mission that Comac and Orla went on as Padawans. And then it is revealed that this group that's kidnapped these two leaders is called the directorship and directorate, and they are a criminal organization syndicate that has kind of been prompted to do this kidnapping by the Hutts, who are hoping that the rescue mission will kind of fail, and that it will be one more way to kind of keep the Republic out of this frontier space, which I thought was pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm. And it's worth noting too that these, I think there's 6 times throughout the story that they kind of jump back to this, and they're all pretty short. They're only, you basically get what's happening from the perspective of the Jedi, and then what's happening perspective of the hostages, as well as a little bit of the hostage takers themselves. But they're typically only a few pages sort of that you get as these little interstitials throughout.
I'll just add from the audiobook side that like they almost like dream sequence these with the sounds, like the tone and everything. So it's like calling back to this, and then it shifts you back in tone again to it, which I think did help since they were so short. It made a little more sense of how they were jumping in and out.
Yeah, and I think especially given the Orla on the path now in the current timeline of becoming a way seeker, and then Comac kind of haunted by his past, these really inform sort of the path their lives have taken, and sort of from this inciting moment, as Padawans. Jumping back to the current timeline with our sort of main cast of characters, after Orla sort of stops them from making the distress call, they're uncertain of responding about it, and Leox and Affy sort of inform them why they themselves, in the frontier, you don't necessarily want to just try and help out everyone, because there's a lot of traps out there. And this is sort of when the Jedi learn about the Nile, which we've heard about in Light of the Jedi and Test of Courage, kind of the baddies of the High Republic era. And so as a precaution, they start to scan for the ships, and sort of identify how many ships are out there, what type of people are on these ships. And in the midst of this, also notice that there's this seemingly abandoned space station nearby, and that they might be able to hold up there and share supplies. And there's also a solar flare that they're scanning is going to pick up, and that it's very obvious that this space station's positioned to where you can dock on one side and be protected from the solar flares. Leox and Affy are nervous that with wanting to share supplies, or maybe have to take refugees on board, that they seem to have some less than legal cargo somewhere in their ship in a hold that's not really public, and that they need to make sure that the Jedi don't become aware of it.
Classic sketchy smuggler moment.
And then Reith, just because of his background and Comac as well, they recognize that this ship is a Maxine technology, and that the Maxines they describe as like a warrior race that basically was just like would go from war to war. And when the Republic and peace sort of started happening, didn't want to fight them anymore. They kind of just went out into the galaxy to look for the next fight, and kind of have not been seen for, I think they almost say like thousands of years or hundreds of years at least. They eventually do reach out to the ship that sort of made the distress call, and it's kind of a pieced together, ramshackled ship made up of different parts of different ships. And it's occupied by Nan and Haig, and Nan is sort of a younger girl, closer in age to Reith. And then Haig they describe as sort of elderly and frail, but is the guardian of Nan and is a Sabrak. And their ship is damaged and sort of gets towed in to the space station by the vessel. Then they sort of use Reith, Des, and Affy to be the boarding party to sort of check out the space station and make sure it's safe and that there's oxygen. And when they board it, they're surprised that everything's sort of been kind of kept intact, but overtaken by, plant life has overgrown throughout the ship. And it's even being that the plants are being kept up by these droids that they call 8Ts, that are basically gardening droids that have gone around and kept this plant life staying alive and thriving for a long time. As Dev and Reith are exploring, they come across some ancient statues, and both of them immediately feel sort of a shadow, dark presence sort of emanating off of these statues.
Yeah, I think the setting for this with the plants was pretty cool, just because it, in contrast to Starlight Beacon and such like a clean station that we've heard from the previous book, like this sounds like an ancient artifact, but still super modern technology relative to us. I don't know about you guys, but like when these 8T droids started getting described, like I just visualized Edward Scissorhands for some reason the whole time.
Yeah,
Going around, like they're talking about them like snipping and just like keeping everything in order. I think the statues, though, is where we really start to get into the real meat of the story.
Yeah, I think you pretty quickly get a sense that there's more going on to this station than it seems. Not only do they feel these statues, but Affy's kind of on high alert, knowing that for some reason the Bind Guild navigation computers directed them to this area for like as a safe way out of hyperspace, and it's not like just in the middle of nowhere. That's clearly like in this region of the station. And she pretty quickly notices that there's things like tools and other stuff that have been abandoned on this space station. And even though the station's been around for a long time, the amount of like plant growth that's gone over those tools looks like to her that it's probably only been, a couple years or potentially months since those were left behind. And so this is a station that's being used by someone that, she thinks is potentially someone in the guild using it to like, either skim some stuff off the top or hide stuff or do other stuff that sort of would be, taking money from her mother's business.
Yeah, and then for me, really interesting that we start off as soon as they get on the station by having the Jedi sense this strong dark side presence, and even I think fairly early on having visions around that Orla and Comac have this very intense, almost out of body experience that Comac it interprets as a warning to them that there is something more nefarious going on. But I think when we were kind of talking through the High Republic launch event, they had described this book as maybe a thriller or kind of more having more horror-esque elements, and you can see that coming into play once they get into the station here.
Yeah, it definitely felt like to me, I think I'd said this to you guys before, but like it could be a Ridley Scott movie or something. Like it had that vibe to it.
A lot of alien vibes, yeah.
Yeah, lots of alien vibes, or even like Venom a little bit. Like the storyline around the symbiote felt kind of similar to me.
Yeah, I kind of got it, the alien vibes, but similar to that game Alien Isolation. It kind of gave me those vibes where it was not people on sort of their own ship that's suddenly been invaded, but like coming to an abandoned ship and like knowing that there's immediately some dark presence that's there that's sort of unseen, and having to sort of find your way around that and see what's up.
Yep.
Yeah, so like you mentioned, Josh, yeah, Orla and Comac come aboard and they immediately sort of sense that same dark presence and have these visions. Affy starts to explore some of she basically describes the space station that consists of these sort of three rings, a central ring and an upper level and then a lower level. She knows that sort of the upper level seems like there's some storage area and goes to investigate that and comes across some handwritten messages. And they point out that like handwritten messages are really uncommon in this area, that everything's done through data pads and some sort of technological way. But within amongst these, she finds dates that she can recognize that are fairly recent, as well as the symbol of the Bind Guild, which sort of confirms her theory that this sort of way station is being used in some regard by some of the pilots within the Bind Guild. while Orla and Comac are sort of checking out the statues, and they realize that sort of it's safe enough internally for everyone to dock, people start to come aboard. This includes Nan and Haig, who Nan kind of immediately takes this interest in Reith that seemingly is kind of like romantic a bit, in that she's like overly interested in everything he says, and he starts to teach her sort of a bit about the Jedi and some of the history there. And then a couple other groups sort of come on board. They mentioned a group, the Mizzy, and then some Orinkens, and that this kind of points out how unaware the Jedi are of sort of the Outer Rim as they're sort of kind of expanding, and that they dock them next to each other, and those two groups sort of hate each other. And so immediately kind of starts a little bit of a rift, and people start looting the station, which leaves Reith trying to sort of on his own as the sole Jedi at the airlock at the time to kind of try and calm what seems to be a potential type of riot breaking out, and starts to fear that he might have to, use his lightsaber for the first time. And with that, it sort of segues into another flashback of 25 years earlier.
I think with Reith and the lightsaber, it's an interesting thing where we just kind of always think of Jedi pulling their lightsabers out whenever to do whatever. And for him, it's like, it's a pretty big moment to realize it's time to do that or to think through it. And he's super hesitant and doesn't here, but he will. I just thought that was an interesting kind of take on the lightsaber situation, since we're just so used to aggressive negotiations as our typical approach.
Yeah, also worth noting that Reith is in this position because Comac is kind of delegated to him. Comac initially is trying to kind of lead the effort of kind of getting everyone docked and organized, and Orla comes and basically says, you're the expert in these ancient languages and these histories, and we've found these idols, and there's languages on these idols that we can't interpret, so we need you. And he kind of quickly gets excited and puts Reith in charge. But it was kind of interesting to see Reith's reaction to being in that leadership position. And I agree with you, Dan, the kind of hesitance to use the lightsaber. And then, as we'll see kind of in subsequent sections, once he actually does have to use a lightsaber, really wrestled with kind of guilt and concern that he may have not done the right thing.
Yeah, you really get this kind of like fish out of water moment for Reith, where he's having to like take command, and he does step up somewhat, but it is one of those things that we've seen in the High Republic so far where the Jedi definitely are like specialized in different areas, and he has been focused in history and the archives, and he's not just the typical warrior that we've seen in a lot of previous Jedis. So I thought that was interesting that it sort of defined that the way they treat Jedis in the High Republic in a further way. Moving into the second part of this flashback, it picks up right where the previous part ended, which was their ship crashing. So Orlak, Comac, Master Lorette, and Simic have crashed. We learned that Simix was a Philithar, which is basically a snake-like race. And because of the shape of his body, the seatbelts didn't really hold him in the same way because he didn't have arms and legs. And so he was actually killed upon sort of impact. And this kind of starts Comac throughout the flashback. He's kind of pretty devastated and shattered, and brings a lot of sort of introspective thoughts from him of, why he's not allowed to mourn someone that, they accept that they're in the Force forever and that that's a good thing. But this was someone they'd spent a lot of time with, and like, why isn't he allowed to just sort of mourn them momentarily in the moment? This sort of gets amplified because they move into some caves to take cover, knowing that they've been shot down. There's probably people coming to look for the ship. They leave Simix's body there, hoping that that'll serve as like a distraction, as though maybe it was just a lone Jedi that was killed in the crash. And when they're in the caves, they see there's some carvings of serpents on the walls. And Comac realizes that, like, I should know what these things are in reference to, because his master told him to study the lore, but he didn't think that was really sort of an important thing to do on a hostage rescue. And so as they're moving to the caves, they're then attacked by a giant white serpent.
Yeah, and you have to wonder if this was maybe the moment when Comac started to take the study of history more serious and kind of, looked at that as maybe his tribute to Simics, because he kind of had failed to take that guidance. And as we'll see in the rest of the novel, he's carrying this weight of Simics' death with him up into, the present, 25 years later.
Yeah, there's been a lot of people who have died in the High Republic, but this had to be the most punk way of dying. I felt like this poor snake can't fit in the seatbelt and dies in a crash. Oh my gosh. And then for them to, encounter snakes basically as the follow-on to it, I think just probably like adds insult to injury for Comac. And this is like the defining point of his life and sets him kind of on a dark trajectory up into where we're at now in present day.
Yeah, and I think we're already seeing with these flashbacks it echoing into Orla and Comac's sort of present time stuff, and that Orla's a little more cautious, immediately stops the distress call because having not done that in the past and sort of just following the Jedi order of like, we got to help everyone, it caused Simics to basically get killed. And then Comac has this obsession with history and folklore and archives, and in this sort of same defining moment hadn't had that same obsession, and it sort of led them into some dangerous areas. Moving back into sort of the riot that started to break out, the looting on the Maxine station. The Jedi, seeing that this sort of happening in different areas, split up to deal with this. And at a point, Nan is kidnapped or being attempted to be kidnapped by one of the Oronkens. And Reith tries to talk him down from this, but the Mancer refuses, and it forces Reith to attack him, strike first, and sort of cut his arm off. And like you were mentioning, Josh, that you get a lot of sort of regret and questioning from Reith after this, as if he should have done the strike first approach, and has a conversation with sort of Des afterwards about, Des says like, yeah, we're supposed to not strike first and sort of wait, but there are always times where there's an exception to this rule in a sense, and we didn't know what they were going to do to Nan, so when her life was in danger, like you had to make that call, and that the council wouldn't see that as a mark against what you did. Eventually the sort of all this stuff spills to become a bit chaotic, and Comac does this interesting maneuver where he basically levitates himself into the sky and is throwing his lightsaber around to like cause a bit of chaos, and uses like almost like a Jedi Force voice to tell everyone to like cut it out and stop it, which kind of causes a forced retreat to people's ships, to where they're able to sort of get everyone calmed down. Leox comes out and gives a speech, and they kind of collectively agree to like, okay, like, yeah, these people have more food, these people have more supplies to repair, these people have some medical stuff, that they can collectively kind of keep all the different supplies grouped together and divide them equally as needed, and sort of keep everyone alive on the station for as long as they can, until it's either safe to travel in hyperspace or they get some sort of rescue. The only exception here is that they send the group of Oronkens that tried to kidnap Nan. They basically give them enough supplies to survive and then kick them off.
Yep. Yeah, I really like this, particularly Leox being kind of the character to cool the temperatures for everyone, and certainly it had a strong impact on Reith. Reith makes a point of noting that he really, at the beginning of their journey, didn't expect to learn anything from Leox, and yet here he is kind of clearly getting a lesson in diplomacy and how to, crowd control without a lightsaber. So Matthew McConaughey in space continues to be a standout character in this story.
Yeah.
And the Comac moment with him levitating, I feel like was kind of like almost like an injustice type of like Gods Among Us type of thing, where he's like, they're becoming terrifying basically to kind of keep them in control. I was thinking also about the genie from Aladdin for some reason, like this phenomenal cosmic powers kind of thing. And they make a point of telling you that that's actually really hard for a Jedi to do. Like it's much easier for them to levitate an object than themselves. which was cool because I hadn't really thought about it until that point. That I think the only time we've seen that is Rey in Rise of Skywalker levitating herself, right? We've not really seen a Jedi levitate, just use it to assist in a jump or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Also, now you say that, Dan, it's a fun little maybe wink to Bell, right? Bell, who was having issues in Light of the Jedi,
Mm-hmm.
like falling with the Force. You know, he had such an issue to the point of thinking he was just going to die.
Yeah.
So this is definitely not an easy feat.
Yeah, I think it's a cool moment too, because thus far we've seen Comax really, the background we know on him is as an archivist and a folklore, and you don't really get a sense of sort of that until this moment that, like, well, he's also, you know, a Jedi, so he is like ultra powerful in a lot of other ways. I think, you know, the way they talk about him wielding his lightsaber even in these moments is really interesting. Sort of once everyone's settled down, the group sort of needs to explore the rest of the station a bit more and sort of see what's going on here. So Des, Reeth, Affy, and Nan, as well as a couple of people from the different ships that are represented, go to explore the lower sort of ring of the station. And it's sort of down through an area that they have to use the vines to climb down, that have overgrown into it. And as they're doing so, they start to, you know, sort of break through some of the vines as they use them as almost like a ladder to go down through. And this triggers the 8Ts to basically start defending the plants and attacking them. So they basically have to bail on that. And during this, Affy gets a cut on her hand and it starts to become infected. And they realize that so not only are the 8Ts defending the plants, but the plants are actually poisonous in some regard. Some of the ones that are sort of nestled within the vines seem to have these spikes and other parts of them. So they basically retreat back to the vessel where Affy is healed up by Des. And then this gives Affy a chance to sort of confront Leox and some of the stuff she'd found about the messages of the Bind Guild having a presence on here. And doesn't really get the answer that she was looking for, and that Leox sort of implies that her mom, Scover Bine, probably is aware of this and really isn't totally clean of maybe using this place as a way to sort of illegally move things around. During this period, Reeth also has a vision similar to what Orla and Comac had. And this kind of prompts the Jedi to discuss what they should be doing with the statues. And they basically come up with this running theory that there's some sort of evil has been contained within these statues. And if they destroy the statues, that would be released. So what they need to do is contain this and move the statues off of the ship, and basically take them back to Coruscant to be dealt with by a larger group of Jedi. Des, in amongst this, wonders if somehow that this darkness was protecting something on the ship, and hints that maybe it was the lower level. That's why they weren't able to get down from the vines, while they're you know, the vines had some poison contained within them, and suggests that they basically should maybe figure out a little bit more of what's down there and go explore that a bit more. So he goes back with Reeth and Affy to visit there, and they come up with the idea that if the ATs are protecting the plants, if they put some plants on their person, like basically like have these little stuff that they stick in their pockets, that the ATs won't want to attack them because they see them as plant life. So that allows them to climb down sort of without being attacked by the gardening droids. And down there, we get a few big moments. So Affy heads one direction, and sort of Des and Reeth head into a different direction. Affy finds some more evidence that the Bind Guild's been there, as well as comes across some references to her birth parents' ship. And her birth parents had sort of been lost years before, and she didn't really know sort of how they died. And so comes across some evidence that maybe her birth parents had been here on this space station. And then Des and Reeth take a different path, and sort of Des is going ahead and gets sort of trapped into a chamber that seems to suddenly get ignited by some like booster engines. And it sort of almost blinds Reeth. And this, I think they say like through the slit of the door, like gives him a sunburn because it's so bright coming through. But basically Reeth goes in there sort of after this burning has happened and Dez is gone, and he comes to the assumption that he'd been trapped in some sort of engine room and was basically disintegrated by these engines activating.
Yeah, this was really dark moment of the book, and quite frankly, it's pretty gutted by it, and just felt like, here's another High Republic book that's murdering people left and right. Didn't feel too out of place, but still, I feel like we were just getting kind of used to Dez and learning about him, and really cool character. So to have him kind of ripped away so quickly in the story was pretty shocking.
I felt like it was also kind of a classic hero's journey part for Reith, that like Dez was in his mind the best of what he could be, and he was the better Padawan for Jorah, and he's just gone. And he's gone in a way that they all kind of, and Comac's like trying to deal with this as well shortly here. Like it's just he's gone in a way that they all felt wasn't good enough of a death for him.
Mm-hmm.
Like he deserved something so much more. So they're not supposed to have that attachment, but they're like attached to both his death and the way in which he died, which is, I think, really tough.
Yeah, and for Orla and for Comac, I think it is yet another trigger for them remembering what happened 25 years ago. And particularly, I think for Comac, with him still carrying the weight of Master Samix's death, he's putting, I think, this on him as well to some extent, carrying the weight of what happened to Dez, and like you're saying, Dan, viewing it as kind of just a senseless loss, that there wasn't even any value to Dez's death. So it's tough. It's tough on the characters, and I think it's just as a reader, you really feel the loss, even though you haven't spent that much time with this character.
Yeah, up to this point, Dez had been my favorite character in this story too, because he was kind of like outside of the, like, I guess, traditional Jedi, in that he was this like, clearly like a great fighter and, up for adventure, but he was also had this like positivity around him, and that he like supported Reith. He like was always interested and, had this kind of like sort of happy-go-lucky attitude. He clearly like was aware of his own faults and trying to like better himself. Like we learned that he had left Zaytuin. So he definitely had this like interesting take on kind of like almost a jolly swashbuckling Jedi, that then just, you would think would go out in some extravagant way. And basically in this moment, it seems as if he's been just like stuck between two doors where a fire is happening and just gets disintegrated.
In contrast to that, the Affy storyline with the Bind Guild for me didn't do it for me. Like it was probably the only part of the story that I wasn't really interested in. And I think like this point was a spot where it like really stepped up because she found out about her parents. But the Dez story was so important right there that it just kind of like overshadowed that for me and felt like kind of a little bit unnecessary filler side story. That being said, I'm assuming the Bind Guild has more importance throughout the High Republic, and that's why they're like seeding this. I mean, it shows up obviously with the Legacy run and Light of the Jedi also. But I don't know how you guys felt about that, but that story for me just kind of felt like a little bit of a sidetrack.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that at this point in the story, it wasn't as interesting as what was happening with the other characters. That being said, I do think it picks up later in the book and becomes more intriguing and more complex. So, but yeah, it felt weird juxtaposed with what happened to Dez, because that was such a kick in the gut, and then you have this other storyline, which is interesting, but just not as impactful as what just happened with the Jedi.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think that like we'll get to it, but I think like the payoff of Affy's story is more interesting. But I think the like pacing of the like other character stories feels a little bit more even, where hers is definitely like weighted more towards the back half of where it gets a little more interesting. At this point, it seems like, I think, they have multiple points where it's like, oh, another message on the wall with the Bind Guild, like they've been here, and it's like, it takes a while before you learn like the importance of what all that maybe means.